The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 64, The Invitation. To live unfiltered is to live fully. Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. This is the final episode of the series. And before we begin, I want to pause and acknowledge something. Creating this project has been more than just making a podcast. It's been a journey of putting myself out there, of deepening my own understanding, of letting my thoughts and feelings be seen in their rawness. It's been empowering, challenging, even fun, and along the way I've received feedback I'm deeply grateful for. If this series has helped even one person, I'll be glad. But more than that, it's been my declaration, an open call for all of us to do the work, each in a form that suits our unique lives, because every one of us carries different experiences, perspectives, and truths. From the beginning, I wrote The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe without bias. I didn't want to anchor it to political parties, fixed ideologies, or rigid belief systems. Not because those things don't matter to some people, but because they are not what defines us at our core. What matters is authenticity, the willingness to live without judgment, the courage to consider each other, the recognition that underneath it all, we are more than the labels and systems imposed upon us. This series has been my way of saying what matters is not the illusions or the performances, but the choice to live honestly, to grow, and to meet one another as we truly are. And now, at the end of this journey, we arrive at the invitation. Not an ending, not a neat conclusion, but an opening. To live unfiltered is not just to drop masks, to resist illusions, or to accept paradox. It is to live fully raw, awake, present, and whole. In this closing episode, we'll look back at the path we've walked, across shadow, alchemy, rebuilding, relationships, edge states, collective struggles, and life beyond the fringe. And then together, we'll step into the invitation to live unfiltered, to live fully, to live awake. Let's begin shadow emotions. The hidden foundation. Every journey begins in the dark. And for the unfiltered human on the fringe, the first step was shadow, the places in ourselves we are told to hide, meeting what we were told to bury, the feelings we were taught to be ashamed of, the emotions that get dismissed as bad, unacceptable, or too much. Envy, lust, anger, shame, guilt, apathy, control. Naming them openly was itself an act of rebellion. These emotions are rarely spoken about without judgment. They live underground, in whispers, in silence, in the places people avoid looking. Yet it was exactly there, in the shadow, that this series began. Why? Because to live unfiltered, we can't skip past the rawness. We can't pretend the shadow isn't there. We have to descend into it, face it, listen to it, and let it speak. Only then can it stop holding us hostage. Themes 1. Envy as mirror. Envy shows us what we desire but have disowned. It points to the life we secretly want, the qualities we admire but won't admit. 2. Lust as fragmentation. Lust revealed how desire is shaped by culture and shame. It showed us how sexuality and longing are often split into fragments, pure or dirty, sacred or profane, when in truth, they are part of the same human drive for connection. 3. Anger as boundary. Anger was a fire we were taught to fear, but buried anger became sickness, and expressed anger became clarity. Anger told us, here is the line that must not be crossed. 4. Shame as disguised. Shame is the great silencer. It bends the body, collapses the voice, hides us in plain sight. Yet when exposed to light, shame reveals not failure but humanity, the desire to be seen and accepted. 5. Guilt as burden. Guilt weighed heavily. Sometimes deserved, often inherited, passed down through family systems, through culture, through unspoken rules. Naming guilt meant sorting what was mine to carry, and what was never mine at all. 6. Apathy as survival. Apathy wasn't laziness, it was emotional anesthesia, the nervous system's way of numbing when life became too much. Apathy revealed the toll of overstimulation and the danger of staying asleep too long. 7. Control as illusion. Control was a cage disguised as safety. It gave a sense of order, but at the cost of freedom. It taught us how fear of chaos can become its own prison. Attributes unwanted. These emotions live in the places society rejects. Unspoken, they shape us in silence, rarely addressed openly. Revealing, when faced, they show hidden needs and truths. Transformative, integrated, they become sources of power and authenticity. Foundational, they are the soil from which deeper healing grows. Meeting what we were told to bury. I imagined the beginning of this series like standing before a cellar door. Everyone around me said, "Don't go down there. There's nothing good to see." But I knew that the cellar was shaping me, whether I opened the door or not. So I stepped inside. And instead of monsters, I found pieces of myself. Envy with its mirror, anger with its fire, shame with its silence, guilt with its burden, apathy with its numbness, control with its cage, lust with its ache for wholeness. They weren't enemies, they were messengers. They were me. The shadow emotions arc wasn't comfortable. It wasn't meant to be. What it offered was truth. Each shadow emotion carried a lesson. Envy told me to stop ignoring my hidden desires. Lust told me to reclaim my body and longing from shame. Anger told me to honor boundaries. Shame told me where I still craved acceptance. Guilt told me to separate what was mine from what was projected onto me. Apathy told me where I was shutting down to survive. Control told me where safety had become suffocation. What I learned is that shadow is not about indulgence or rejection. It is about integration. When you bring these emotions into the light, they stop distorting you from the dark. Jung called shadow the thing a person has no wish to be. I found the opposite was true. The shadow was exactly where I needed to look to become whole. Personal reflection. For me, speaking these emotions out loud on the podcast was a revelation. I had lived with them all my life, the quiet shame, the unspoken guilt, the numbing apathy. But naming them, reflecting on them, inviting others to see themselves in them, that lifted some of their weight. I think back to anger. Growing up, I saw what happened when anger was suppressed, and I also saw what happened when it exploded without control. For years, I learned to bury my own, but eventually, it broke through. I realized anger wasn't there to destroy me. It was there to protect me, to say this matters. Or shame. There were times it collapsed me, shut me down mid-sentence, made me want to disappear. But when I spoke it out loud, its power diminished. It became human, not monstrous. Even apathy, times when I went numb, switched off, felt nothing. I once thought that meant failure. But now I see it as survival. The body's way of saying, you need to stop before you break. The challenge isn't feeling apathy. It's not staying there forever. Each of these emotions was alive in me. And by meeting them, I began to meet myself. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, shadow emotions taught me to stop seeing myself as broken. They reframed what I once thought of as flaws into signals. Envy wasn't just bitterness, it was desire unclaimed. Shame wasn't weakness, it was a wound longing for recognition. This is the psychological shift. The shadow as information, not condemnation. At the group level, I saw how shadow emotions operate collectively. Shame is used to silence dissent. Guilt is weaponized to keep people obedient. Control is imposed as safety. Groups that suppress their shadow become fragile because they lose honesty. The moment someone speaks the truth, the illusion collapses. At the societal level, shadow is everywhere. Envy is exploited by advertising, lust is commodified, anger is policed, shame is institutionalized, guilt is distributed across populations, apathy is encouraged through endless distraction, and control is sold to us as freedom through surveillance, policies, protection. I realized then, shadow is not just personal, it's systemic, and facing it is not just healing, it's resistance. Embodiment, prompt, or practice, find a quiet space. Whisper to yourself, what shadow emotion is most alive in me right now? Don't analyze it, let it come. Place a hand on your body where you feel it. Whisper, I see you, you belong, you are not the enemy. Insight, prompt of the shadow emotions, envy, lust, anger, shame, guilt, apathy, and control, which has shaped your life the most. And what would it mean to see it not as an enemy, but as a teacher? Integration moment shadow is the beginning, because it is the truth we cannot escape. To live unfiltered means to stop hiding from what is already shaping us. Shadow work is not about erasing the dark, but walking into it with eyes open. Seed to plant. The emotions you fear facing are the ones that lead you to freedom. The shadow was never against you, it was always part of you, waiting to be met. How did shadow become the raw material for transformation? Integration and alchemy. Turning pain into power shadow was where the journey began, in the cellar of buried emotions, in the places most people avoid. But shadow alone doesn't transform us. It shows us what's there, but it doesn't yet change the weight of it. That's where integration and alchemy came in. These weren't just abstract ideas. They were about what happens when we stop running from pain and instead invite it to sit at the table. Integration asks us to bring home the parts of ourselves we exiled. From ashes to gold, alchemy asks us to use those parts as fuel to turn the heaviness of survival into the energy of becoming. This wasn't about denial or painting suffering in gold. It was about discovering that the ashes of what I thought had destroyed me were also the soil where new life could take root. Themes 1. Integration as wholeness. When we're young, we learn to split. We split between what is acceptable and what isn't, between the good child and the parts that bring punishment. Integration is the reversal of that split, the courage to let every part come back home. 2. Alchemy as transformation. Alchemy is one of the oldest spiritual metaphors, turning lead into gold. In human terms, it means turning heaviness into meaning, pain into wisdom, brokenness into insight. 3. Meaning from suffering. Suffering without meaning crushes us. Suffering with meaning reshapes us. Viktor Frankl discovered this in the camps. The last freedom is the ability to choose meaning in the face of suffering. 4. Living with paradox. Integration and alchemy both demand paradox. To embrace grief without drowning in it. To embrace joy without denying loss. To accept both light and shadow as part of wholeness. Attributes inclusive. Integration doesn't exile any part. Transformative. Alchemy changes the weight of pain into strength. Narrative. Meaning makes pain bearable. Paradoxical. Wholeness carries contradictions without collapse. I imagine alchemy like holding the ashes of what I thought was my destruction, and realizing that in those ashes was the raw material for the next stage of life. Integration and alchemy aren't glamorous. They don't give you instant light, instant freedom. They ask for work, the daily work of noticing, including reframing. Integration meant asking myself, what part of me have I tried to bury, and then refusing to bury it again? Alchemy meant asking, what could this pain become if I stopped seeing it as waste? In My Inner Child Was Broken, I spoke about how survival fractures us into roles: the performer, the protector, the appeaser. Integration was the act of letting those children come home. Alchemy was the process of saying, the scars you carry don't have to just tell stories of hurt, they can also be the place where strength was born. In the Inversiverse, I explored how culture itself fragments us. Media, governments, and institutions teach us to split into acceptable and unacceptable selves. Integration here wasn't just personal, it was cultural resistance, to refuse the division, to see the full picture instead of the manipulated half. Alchemy, at that level, meant not just reclaiming self, but reclaiming perception. And in this podcast, I realized integration is a muscle. Every time I looked at envy, lust, anger, shame, guilt, apathy, or control, and soul, and so you belong too, I was practicing integration. Every time I turned pain into a reflection, into language, into resonance for others, I was practicing alchemy. This was never about perfection. It was about wholeness, personal reflection. For me, alchemy came in moments I didn't expect. There were nights when grief sat so heavy it felt like there was nothing left. But in speaking it, in writing it, in sharing it, grief turned into depth. The very heaviness I thought would crush me became the reason I could sit with someone else in their pain without flinching. Integration happened in quieter ways. I noticed when I slipped back into performance, when I left part of myself outside the room. But instead of shaming myself for it, I tried to welcome the awareness itself. That act of noticing was integration. Spiritually, I once thought awakening was about transcendence, about rising above the mess. But integration and alchemy taught me something else. Awakening is not leaving the mess, it's including it. It's the courage to let shadow and light sit in the same body, in the same breath. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, integration and alchemy meant reframing survival strategies. The false self Winnicott spoke about wasn't a failure, it was survival. The task wasn't to kill it off, but to integrate it, to let it rest while the true self slowly grew. My own journey mirrored this. The mask wasn't the enemy, it was the child doing their best. Alchemy came when I stopped hating the mask and began to thank it for carrying me this far. At the group level, integration showed me how relationships can be crucibles for alchemy. Some relationships demand performance. They keep you fractured. Others allow honesty. They invite you into wholeness. I've seen the difference, felt the weight lift when I was allowed to be unfiltered, and felt the drain when I wasn't. Alchemy here is when communities allow pain to become shared meaning instead of hidden silence. At the societal level, integration and alchemy are acts of defiance. Culture thrives on disintegration, on splitting people into categories, ideologies, binaries. Integration disrupts that, refusing to accept fragmentation as natural. Alchemy disrupts it further, turning collective suffering, grief, outrage, trauma into movements, into meaning, into resilience. You can see this in history. Revolutions are often born from alchemy when pain becomes purpose. Embodiment, prompt, or practice. Close your eyes. Bring to mind one part of yourself you've exiled, a memory, an emotion, a way of being. Place your hands on your chest and whisper, "You belong. I welcome you home." Then ask, "What gold could grow from this part if I stopped treating it as waste?" Insight prompt, "What pain in your life feels meaningless right now? How might integration and alchemy turn it into strength, depth, or wisdom?" Integration moment, integration and alchemy taught me this. Pain doesn't vanish, but it can transform. Survival isn't shameful, but it isn't the end of the story. Wholeness isn't perfection, but it is possible. And the ashes you thought would bury, you may be the very material that becomes your gold. Seed to plant integration is homecoming. Alchemy is transformation. Together they turn brokenness into the path toward wholeness. Ashes to architecture. The rebuild when something collapses, when masks fall, when shadows surface, when pain is integrated, there's always a question left. What now? Ashes alone aren't enough. Alchemy is transformation, yes, but transformation needs a form, a rebuilt life, a structure we can actually live inside. This is where the journey turned from survival to design, from looking back at what had been lost to looking forward at what could be created. Themes 1. Rebuilding identity. After shadow work, identity is no longer performance. The question becomes, who am I when I stop playing the role? 2. Rebuilding values. Survival teaches compliance. Rebuilding asks, what values are truly mine and what were inherited from others? 3. Rebuilding practices. Healing isn't abstract. It becomes a daily ritual, choices and habits. Architecture isn't just vision, it's brick by brick. 4. Rebuilding community. The life we rebuild requires spaces where authenticity is safe. Relationships shift, groups fall away, but what remains becomes the foundation. Attributes intentional. Rebuilding is conscious, not automatic. Grounded, it takes form in daily choices, not only in ideas. Courageous. Rebuilding means letting go of structures that once felt safe. Creative, it is an act of design, of authorship, of creation. Building a life after the fire. I imagine rebuilding like walking through the ruins of a house that once held you. The walls are gone, the ashes are cold, but in your hands are new tools, and in your heart is a vision. This time, the structure will be yours. Rebuilding was where the inner work of integration became outer work. How do I now live differently? In my inner child was broken, I realized that the inner fractures had shaped everything about how I related to the world. Rebuilding meant I could no longer organize my life around survival. I had to build it around truth. That meant asking, what kind of relationships nourish me? What kind of work aligns with my values? What rhythms of life help me stay awake rather than put me back to sleep? In the Inversiverse, I explored how cultural structures shape identity and perception. Rebuilding here was not just personal. It was about resisting cultural architecture that was built for control, media narratives, surveillance, and indoctrination. To live unfiltered meant designing an inner architecture strong enough not to collapse under the weight of those illusions. In this podcast, the act of rebuilding became explicit. Each episode was a brick. Every reflection, every insight, every story wasn't just about naming the shadow. It was about constructing an alternative, a way of living that is awake, authentic, and sovereign. Rebuilding is ongoing, but it gave me a foundation that survival never could. Personal reflection for me. Rebuilding meant real choices. It wasn't just a metaphor. It meant walking away from communities that demanded performance. It meant refusing to accept careers or roles that suffocated authenticity. It meant sitting with myself long enough to hear what I actually wanted, not what I was told to want. There were times I felt homeless in the process, as if tearing down the old left me with nothing. But slowly, brick by brick, a new life began to take shape. Spiritually, rebuilding meant no longer chasing light as escape, but grounding myself in practices that kept me present. Journaling, walking, speaking truth. Even small rituals became beams in the architecture of my life. What I discovered was this: rebuilding isn't glamorous. It's slow, it's repetitive, it's daily, but over time those bricks form walls. Those walls become a home. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, rebuilding mirrors what trauma therapists call post-traumatic growth. After rupture, people either rebuild stronger foundations or remain in cycles of survival. For me, this meant recognizing that my nervous system needed new rhythms, practices that regulated, grounded, and kept me awake to my choices. At the group level, rebuilding meant choosing relationships carefully. Some people fit into the old architecture: performance, compliance, and avoidance. Those relationships didn't survive the fire, but others, who allowed honesty, became cornerstones. The architecture of a sovereign life is supported by sovereign relationships. At the societal level, rebuilding meant seeing culture itself as architecture. Institutions build structures of perception and behavior. Media narratives, political scripts, and educational indoctrination. To live unfiltered, I had to notice those blueprints and refuse to build my life on them. Instead, I began to draft my own blueprint, one of authenticity and freedom. Rebuilding is always both inner and outer. It is a psychological, relational, and cultural act. Embodiment, prompt, or practice. Imagine yourself in a room that has collapsed. Around you are ashes, fragments, broken beams. Now imagine yourself picking up one tool: a pen, a brick, a candle, a voice. What is the first thing you would rebuild if this were your life? Insight prompt. What part of your life feels like it has been reduced to ashes? And what small intentional step could you take this week to begin rebuilding it in alignment with your truth? Integration moment. Rebuilding is the bridge between shadow and sovereignty. It is the act of taking the ashes of what collapsed and choosing to design again. The structures of survival will not hold, but the architecture of authenticity can. Seed to plant. Rebuilding is not about recreating the old house. It is about designing a new one that can hold who you truly are. The relational series, living unfiltered together. If rebuilding gave me a structure to live in, relationships became the walls of glass, transparent, fragile, reflective, because it's one thing to claim sovereignty in solitude, and another to practice it in intimacy. Relationships expose us. They test whether our authenticity is real or whether we're still hiding behind performance. They show us the places where we long to be unfiltered but fear rejection. In this arc, the work moved from the self into the space between selves. Living unfiltered meant risking not only my own authenticity, but also inviting others into it. Themes 1. Intimacy as exposure. Relationships strip away the illusion of control. They bring us face to face with what we hide. 2. Vulnerability as currency. The deeper the intimacy, the greater the risk, but also the greater the potential for truth. 3. Performance in connection. Many relationships thrive on masks. We play the roles of partner, parent, friend, lover. Breaking those roles is risky but necessary. 4. Love without armor. The real invitation of relationships is to love and be loved without armor, not invincible, but seen. Attributes relational. Authenticity lives and dies in the space between people. Courageous. To be unfiltered with another is riskier than to be unfiltered alone. Testing. Relationships show whether the work has truly taken root. Sacred. Intimacy becomes the site where authenticity blossoms. Intimacy as the mirror of truth. I picture intimacy like a mirror placed inches from my face. Alone, I can convince myself of wholeness. With another, the cracks are visible. Intimacy shows what I'd rather not see, but it also shows me what's real. The relational arc taught me that no amount of solitary work can bypass the challenge of connection. We are tested in a relationship because it's there that our masks are most tempting. Intimacy without authenticity is performance. Love without vulnerability is theatre. And connection without truth is fragile, always at risk of collapse. In my inner child was broken. I wrote about how early wounds shape the way we attach, protect, and perform. Those patterns don't vanish in adulthood, they surface in intimacy. For me, rebuilding relationships meant recognizing those childhood scripts and refusing to keep repeating them. In the Inversiverse, I explored how cultural narratives infiltrate even our private bonds. Gender roles, scripts of romance, ideas of dominance and submission, they all perform on us, often without our noticing. To live unfiltered in a relationship meant seeing through those scripts and asking, what does love look like when it's ours, not theirs? And in this podcast, intimacy became a thread across multiple episodes, from envy and lust to shame and control. Each shadow emotion found its sharpest expression in a relationship. Each act of integration became most difficult and most necessary in intimacy. What I learned is this: unfiltered living is never fully proven alone. It is proven in how we meet others mask-free, personal reflection. For me, relationships have been the hardest place to remain unfiltered. I could do the work alone, journaling, reflecting, speaking into a microphone. But intimacy demanded more. It asked me to risk. I recall times I wanted to stay silent to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. Performance was easier than honesty. But each time I chose performance, the connection weakened. Each time I chose honesty, even when it led to conflict, the connection deepened. I've also seen how my own shadow emotions played out relationally. Anger withheld created distance. Shame collapsed intimacy before it could grow. Control disguised itself as care. Recognizing those patterns wasn't easy, but it was essential. The most powerful relationships I've known weren't the easiest ones. They were the ones where masks fell, where truth was spoken, where vulnerability was honored. That's where I learned what intimacy really is: psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, relationships force us to confront our attachment patterns. Bowlby and Ainsworth's work on attachment theory showed how early bonds shape adult intimacy. For me, the move from anxious attachment, seeking safety in performance, toward more secure relating mirrored the journey from filtered to unfiltered living. At the group level, relationships expand into families, friendships, and communities. Performance here can become generational. I've seen how silence, avoidance, or unspoken rules dominate groups. Alchemy here is collective. When one person dares to be honest, the whole group shifts. At the societal level, intimacy is politicized. From laws regulating sexuality to cultural scripts defining marriage, societies script our closest bonds. To live unfiltered in love is therefore not just personal rebellion, it is social resistance. It's the refusal to let intimacy be defined by performance scripts. For me, the relational series made one truth unavoidable: intimacy is the crucible of authenticity. Embodiment prompt or practice: think of one relationship where you most often perform. Close your eyes and picture yourself speaking one truth you've been holding back. Notice your fear. Notice also the freedom that rises when you imagine being real. Insight prompt: where in your relationships are you still wearing armor? And what might it feel like to set one piece of it down? Integration moment: relationships are where authenticity is tested. To live unfiltered alone is one step. To live unfiltered together is another. Intimacy without masks is risky, but it is the only intimacy worth having. Seed to plant love without armor. Connection without performance. Intimacy without masks. This is where living unfiltered becomes real. Edge states. Standing at the thresholds. Every life has thresholds, moments where the ground beneath us feels unstable, where the old is falling apart and the new hasn't yet taken form. I've come to think of these as edge states. Edge states are precarious. They are where collapse and transformation meet, where grief and awakening bleed into each other, where clarity feels close, but certainty is nowhere to be found. In this arc, I learned that living unfiltered means not avoiding the edge, but learning to stand there, trembling, awake, open to what comes next. Themes 1. Liminality: as teacher edges are liminal spaces. They are thresholds betwixt and between. Transformation happens here, not in comfort. 2. Vulnerability of collapse. At the edge, we feel undone. The risk of falling into despair or chaos is real, but collapse itself often cracks us open. 3. Creativity: of thresholds, edges are also creative. They destabilize us so we can remake ourselves. They strip away certainty so new forms can emerge. 4. Awakening at the border's edges are where awakening often happens. Mystics across traditions spoke of nights as thresholds to deeper seeing. Attributes unstable, edges shake the ground beneath us. Revealing, they expose what comfort conceals. Transformative, thresholds open possibilities the center never could. Spiritual, edge states echo ancient rites of passage. The borderlands of becoming I imagine standing at a cliff edge. Behind me the familiar path. Ahead the unknown. My legs shake, my chest tightens. But the view is wider than anything I've seen before. This is the borderland, dangerous, uncertain, alive. The Edge States arc showed me that thresholds are both terrifying and essential. You don't choose them, they arrive. In grief, in breakdowns, in awakenings, in moments where certainty dissolves. In My Inner Child Was Broken, I described the edge as moments of collapse, when the old ways of surviving no longer worked. Those were painful thresholds, but they forced me into new ways of being. In the Inversiverse, I saw edges at a cultural level, the thresholds of collapsing narratives, of people waking up to systems of control, of disillusionment with illusions of freedom. These edges are unstable, but they are also moments of possibility, when people begin to see through what they once accepted. And in this podcast, edge states appeared in every arc, anger breaking into silence, shame collapsing the self-intimacy testing vulnerability. Each of those moments was an edge. They were uncomfortable, yes, but also generative. Edges aren't comfortable, but they are alive. Personal reflection. For me, one of the most defining edge states was my spiritual awakening. It wasn't gentle, it was destabilizing. I felt like the ground had given way beneath me, that everything I thought I knew was dissolving. At the time, I didn't have neat language for it. It felt like madness and clarity at once. Looking back, I can see that it was both collapse and expansion. That edge was the place where I realized I couldn't go back to sleep even if I wanted to. Other edges have come through grief, moments of loss that stripped me down to something raw. At the time, they felt unbearable. But in retrospect, they cracked me open to tenderness, to compassion, to the kind of depth no comfort could have given me. Edges are frightening, but they are also where I felt most awake. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, edges mirror what psychology calls disintegration. Kazimierz Dabrowski described positive disintegration as the breaking apart of old structures so new, higher ones can form. Collapse is painful but necessary. My own breakdowns, my awakenings, were lived examples of this theory. At the group level, edge states appear in relationships and communities. Breakdowns in trust, collapses of shared illusions, conflicts that destabilize. These are edges, too, painful, but also opportunities to rebuild more authentic bonds. At the societal level, we see edges in cultural crises, economic collapse, political upheaval, and climate breakdown. These edges reveal the fragility of systems, but they also open possibilities for new architectures of living. The danger is real, but so is the potential. Edges are where life cracks, but cracks let light in. Embodiment prompt or practice close your eyes. Picture yourself standing at an edge, personal, relational, or cultural. Breathe into the instability. Whisper, I am not falling, I am opening. Insight prompt. What edge in your life feels unstable right now? What might it be teaching you if you stopped resisting it? Integration moment edges are frightening because they dissolve certainty. But they are also sacred because they open possibilities. To live unfiltered is to stand at the threshold without rushing back to safety. Seed to plant, the edge is not the end, it is the borderland of becoming. How does unfiltered living resist them at the cultural level? Collective shadows. The weight we carry together shadow doesn't end at the self. The patterns we avoid individually, envy, control, apathy, and shame, expand outward until they become embedded in entire cultures. Collective shadows are the unspoken agreements societies make. The truths too uncomfortable to face, the hypocrisies papered over, the illusions maintained so life can carry on. They are reinforced through institutions, politics, religion, and media. And like a personal shadow, they distort us until they are acknowledged. To live unfiltered, then, is not just to face your own darkness. It is to face the shadows we carry together. Themes 1. Projection as politics. What societies refuse to face in themselves, they project outward onto scapegoats, minorities, and enemies. 2. Controllers comfort collective shadows thrive by selling safety, surveillance, censorship, conformity, each justified as protection. 3. Silence as agreement. When enough people stay silent, shadows calcify. Collective denial becomes the air we breathe. 4. Awakening as disruption. To name a collective shadow is disrupt the script. It is often punished, but it is also necessary. Attributes hidden in plain sight. Collective shadows are rarely secret, just normalized. Systemic, they are embedded in laws, institutions, and media. Protective, they give the illusion of order while masking dysfunction. Fragile, when exposed, they can unravel quickly. The mirror of society, I imagine collective shadows as a theatre where everyone knows the play is fake, but no one dares to stop the performance. We clap, we smile, we recite our lines because to interrupt would expose the lie. Living unfiltered means daring to interrupt. The collective shadow's arc reveals that society is built on the same dynamics as individuals. Just as we bury our envy, shame, or rage, cultures bury the truths that don't fit the script. In the Inversiverse, I saw this most clearly. Surveillance sold as safety, propaganda sold as truth, control disguised as freedom. Collective shadows are the architecture of illusion. In My Inner Child Was Broken, I recognized the echoes in family systems. Secrets no one speaks, patterns passed down silently, wounds inherited. Families are microcosms of cultures. What is denied at home is often denied at scale. And in this podcast, collective shadows surfaced again and again. The way shame is institutionalized, the way guilt is weaponized, the way apathy is encouraged. These aren't accidents. They are mechanisms of control. The hardest truth I learned here was this. Collective shadows persist because they are convenient. People prefer comfort to truth. To live unfiltered, then, is to resist that convenience, even when it makes you an outsider. Personal reflection. For me, the collective shadow became most visible growing up in the 80s and 90s. I remember noticing how language itself was being policed. People would lower their voices, say, I shouldn't say this, even when their thoughts and feelings were valid. Authenticity was being traded for compliance. Later, I saw the same dynamic on a larger scale. Governments repeating votes until they got the result they wanted. Safety is used as a justification for endless surveillance. Double standards where evidence caught on camera could be dismissed if it didn't serve power. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. I've never been able to shake the awareness that collective shadows don't just distort society, they hurt individuals. People's nervous systems crash under the weight of unspeakable truths. Anger and frustration rise, not from disagreement, but from the inability to even voice what is real. That's why speaking out, even in small ways, became essential for me, because silence only feeds the shadow. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, collective shadows shape us before we even notice. Children absorb what is safe to say and what is forbidden. They learn silence before they learn speech. For me, that early awareness of unspoken rules was one of the ways I first sensed how shadow works. At the group level, shadows are enforced by communities. That's just how things are. Don't rock the boat. Families, schools, and religious groups each have their own unspoken code of denial. Breaking that code makes you a problem, even when you're telling the truth. At the societal level, collective shadows become ideology. They are embedded in institutions and sold through culture. Media normalizes distraction. Politics normalizes corruption. Religion normalizes suppression. But beneath it all, the cracks are visible. One person naming the shadow can inspire others to do the same. And once the shadow is visible, it loses power. For me, this is where the personal and the cultural met. To live unfiltered is to resist not only personal illusions, but collective ones. It is to refuse the comfort of silence. Embodiment prompt or practice sit in silence for a moment. Whisper to yourself, what truth in my world feels dangerous to name? Notice where your body tenses. Breathe into that place. Imagine speaking the truth anyway, even if only to yourself. Insight prompt. What collective shadow have you noticed in your community, your culture, or your country? And what would it mean to live unfiltered in the face of it? Integration moment collective shadows remind us that authenticity isn't only personal, it is political, cultural, and systemic. To live unfiltered is to be willing to stand outside the script, to risk silence breaking into speech, to name what others fear to see. Seed to plant. The shadow of society is just the shadow of its people. To live unfiltered is to refuse silence for yourself and for the world. Beyond the fringe, living unfiltered after shadow, integration, rebuilding, intimacy, edges, and collective awakenings, there is still one question left. What does it mean to live unfiltered here now? The whole journey has been pointing to this. Shadow showed me what I had buried. Alchemy showed me how to transform it. Rebuilding gave me new foundations. Relationships tested whether I could remain authentic with others. Edge states broke me open at the thresholds of change. Collective shadows revealed the wider illusions shaping us all. But beyond all that lies the choice to live unfiltered. Not just to analyze, not just to reflect, but to live. Themes 1. Sovereignty as awakening sovereignty means authorship of one's own life. It means no longer living asleep inside systems that profit from your silence. The etymology of sovereign hints at this, often linked with supreme authority, but in some linguistic roots, sova echoes sleep. To regain sovereignty is to awaken from the sleep we've been conditioned into. 2. Authenticity as resistance. To live unfiltered in a filtered world is resistance. Societies built on performance, surveillance, and control will always reward masks. Dropping them is both personal liberation and cultural rebellion. 3. Paradox as wholeness unfiltered living doesn't mean clarity without contradiction. It means holding paradox, grief and joy, love and anger, freedom and responsibility without collapse. 4. Radical intimacy. At the fringe, relationships become laboratories of truth. Radical intimacy is the willingness to trust and love without armor, to risk rejection for the sake of honesty. 5. Spiritual honesty. To live unfiltered spiritually means refusing to bypass, neither romanticizing light nor demonizing shadow. It is the courage to face both and to let awakening be messy, embodied, and real. 6. Choosing freedom over performance. Performance gives safety but takes life. Freedom is risky but alive. Living unfiltered means choosing freedom every time, even when it costs us approval. Attributes embodied. Unfiltered living is not a concept. It is lived in breath, word, and action. Risky. It costs the comfort of masks and the safety of conformity. Relational. It is tested in how we meet others, not just in solitude. Transcendent. It carries us beyond illusions into presence. Ordinary. It happens not in grand gestures, but in daily choices. Life without masks. I picture living unfiltered as stepping into the world without the costumes I once thought kept me safe. No script, no disguise, no armor. Just skin, voice, breath, presence. It is terrifying, and it is the only way I've ever truly felt alive. Living unfiltered is not a destination. It is a daily practice, a choice, a discipline of presence. It means waking up each day and refusing to sleepwalk through life. It means noticing when performance creeps back in and gently setting it down. It means recognizing when shame whispers hide and choosing instead to speak. It also means accepting paradox. That wholeness isn't neat. That freedom doesn't mean comfort. That sovereignty doesn't mean isolation, but a deeper connection. In my inner child was broken. Living unfiltered meant refusing to let childhood fractures define adulthood. It meant reclaiming the child who learned silence, shame, and performance, and letting him grow into authenticity. In the Inversiverse, it meant facing the illusions of culture, surveillance, propaganda, indoctrination, and choosing to live awake within them. To not be lulled by the noise, to not be anesthetized by distraction. And in this podcast, living unfiltered meant showing up raw, unscripted, naming what people don't want to name. Envy, shame, guilt, apathy, control. It meant telling truths that felt risky. It meant declaring out loud that the filtered life is not worth living. To live unfiltered is to accept that masks may bring safety, but they cannot bring life. Personal reflection. For me, arriving here has been both liberating and costly. I think of the times when speaking the truth made me feel exposed. Times when people withdrew, judged, or misunderstood. Living unfiltered has meant losing the comfort of being liked by everyone. But it has also meant gaining something far greater, the ability to look at myself in the mirror and know I was real. I think of my spiritual awakening, destabilizing, overwhelming, but ultimately clarifying. That was when I realized how much of life is lived asleep. To awaken was both painful and empowering. Painful, because it meant I could no longer play along with illusions. Empowering, because it meant I was finally sovereign. I think too of the contradictions. How can I feel grief and joy on the same day? How can I love deeply and still feel fear? How can I be awake and still stumble? Living unfiltered hasn't removed paradox. It has taught me to carry it. And I've seen how others respond. Some are unsettled, others are drawn to it. But always it creates space, space where truth is possible, where masks can fall, where human beings can meet as they are. For me, beyond the fringe, living unfiltered is not a theory. It is the pulse of life itself, psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, living unfiltered means integration embodied. Jung spoke of individuation, becoming whole by integrating the shadow. Winnicott spoke of the true self emerging when performance can rest. Living unfiltered is these theories made flesh. It is the adult who no longer hides the child, the sovereign who no longer sleeps. At the group level, living unfiltered means creating communities that resist performance. I've seen how most groups survive on scripts, silence, avoidance, conformity. But when even one person lives unfiltered, the whole atmosphere shifts. Masks fall, conversations deepen, trust begins. Living unfiltered is contagious. At the societal level, unfiltered living is disruptive. Cultures depend on collective performance, on people playing their roles in silence. To live unfiltered is to resist propaganda, to speak what is real, to refuse illusions even when they are comfortable. Philosophers like Camus spoke of revolt as a stance, saying no to absurdity. Living unfiltered is revolt, but it is also affirmation. It is saying yes to life in all its mess, paradox, and rawness. Embodiment prompt practice. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Whisper, what mask am I wearing right now? Notice how your body feels when you imagine setting it down. Breathe again and whisper, this is me. This is enough. Insight prompt for listeners. Where in your life are you still performing? What would it mean in one small act this week to live unfiltered instead? Integration moment beyond the fringe. Life is not about perfection. It is about presence. It is about waking up from the sleep of conformity, setting down the armor of performance, and choosing again and again to be real. To live unfiltered is not just the closing of this series. It is the opening of life itself. Seed to plant to live unfiltered is to live fully. To live fully is to live awake. And to live awake is to remember the mask was never life, only the face beneath it was. The invitation to live unfiltered is to live fully hello and welcome one last time. You're listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. This is the closing of the journey. The final moment in a series that has spanned shadow and alchemy, rebuilding and intimacy, thresholds and awakenings, collective mirrors and sovereign choices. I want to begin with gratitude. Gratitude to you, the listener, who has walked with me through this. Gratitude to the parts of myself that risked exposure to speak. Gratitude to the process itself, because creating this series wasn't just a way of offering something to the world. It was also a way of becoming more myself. When I first began, I didn't know how it would unfold. What I did know was this. Some truths live in silence, in the shadow, in the edges we avoid. And if we are to live fully, those truths need to be voiced. This series became my way of voicing them. Looking back, the arc of the journey we began in the shadows. Envy, lust, anger, shame, guilt, apathy, control. The emotions we are told to bury. The parts of ourselves we exile. They became the starting point because they are unavoidable. To live unfiltered, we must face what we hide. From shadow, we moved into integration and alchemy. We learned that brokenness isn't the end, but the beginning. That the ashes of collapse are the soil of transformation. That suffering can be reframed, transmuted, turned into meaning. Then came the rebuild, from ashes to architecture. The painstaking work of daily choices, new values, new practices, new communities. Healing is not just reflection, it's design. It's building a life we can actually live inside. After that, we faced intimacy, relationships as crucibles of truth, the hardest place to remain unfiltered, where masks are most tempting, where vulnerability feels like exposure. but also where love without armor becomes possible. Then came the edge states, thresholds, nights, liminal spaces where the ground gives way, the terrifying and sacred moments where collapse and awakening meet, where we are undone and remade. From there, we turn to collective shadows, the places where entire societies bury truth, where governments sell surveillance as safety, where the media sells envy as aspiration, where silence is rewarded and truth is punished. To live unfiltered here is to resist not only personal illusions, but cultural ones. And finally, we arrived at the fringe. Beyond the scripts, beyond the masks, beyond the illusions. The space where sovereignty, paradox, intimacy, and honesty converge into a lived philosophy. To live unfiltered is to live fully. That has been the arc, the circle, the journey. The personal thread for me, this wasn't just content. It was lived. It was drawn from my life, my experiences, my awakenings, my struggles. I think back to my childhood, the fractures, the survival strategies, the masks I learned to wear. That became my inner child was broken. A book, yes, but also a mirror. Writing it was part of integration. Speaking about it here was part of alchemy. I think back to the Inversiverse, the project that explored perception, reality, and indoctrination. That work shaped the way I see culture as architecture, as illusion, as manipulation. It taught me that living unfiltered is not just personal healing, but cultural resistance. And then there was this podcast, Raw, Unedited Human, a space where I spoke out loud the things people often keep hidden, a place where shadow emotions could breathe, where intimacy could be tested, where collective illusions could be named. Each project has been part of the same journey. Each one is a different expression of the same invitation. To wake up, to live authentically, to resist illusions, to embrace paradox. I didn't create this to present myself as finished, perfected, or enlightened. I created it as a declaration that I was willing to be seen, a declaration that we all carry a shadow, a declaration that unfiltered living is messy, contradictory, and necessary. The universal invitation. And now, as we close, I want to turn the focus to you. What does living unfiltered mean in your life? Maybe it means naming a shadow emotion you've hidden for years. Maybe it means reclaiming a part of yourself you exiled. Maybe it means walking away from performance in a relationship that demands masks. Maybe it means resisting the scripts of culture that want you silent, compliant, asleep. Whatever it looks like, the invitation is the same. Live unfiltered. Not recklessly, not without care, but honestly, authentically. Fully, living unfiltered is not a one-time decision. It is daily, it is moment by moment. It is noticing when performance creeps in and choosing again to be real. And here's the truth, it's not easy. It costs comfort. It risks rejection. It unsettles those around you who would rather stay asleep. But it also gives you life, real life, awake life, present life. And isn't that what we came here for? Spiritual and philosophical depth philosophically. I think of Nietzsche's amor fati, the love of fate. To say yes to everything, not just the pleasant, but the painful, the shadowed, the paradoxical. Living unfiltered is an act of amor fati. Camus spoke of revolt, the decision to live honestly in the face of absurdity, to say no to illusions and yes to life itself. Living unfiltered is revolt, but revolt infused with compassion, with intimacy, with presence. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, of becoming whole. Winnicott spoke of the true self, the self that emerges when performance can rest. Both point to the same truth: authenticity is liberation. Spiritually, I think of mystics across traditions who spoke of awakening not as escape, but as presence, the night of the soul, the fire that burns away illusions. The paradox of light and shadow is inseparable. Living unfiltered is spiritual honesty, the refusal to bypass, the willingness to face both. And culturally, I think of our moment now, a time of distraction, surveillance, noise. To live unfiltered here is radical. It is resistance. It is remembered that freedom is not given by systems, it is chosen by souls. The final declaration. So here we are, at the edge of the journey, at the close of the circle. To live unfiltered is to live fully. To live fully is to live awake. To live awake is to resist illusions, embrace paradox, speak truth, love without armor, and walk into the world without masks. This isn't an ending, it's an invitation, an opening, a seed planted. The invitation is simple. be unfiltered, be human, be awake. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Thank you for listening, reflecting, and carrying these words into your own life. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. And as always, stay unfiltered, stay human, and remember, the mask was never life, only the face beneath it was. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of The Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.